What's happening, friends? Welcome back to Dynamo DeFi. The curve wars are one of the most important concepts in decentralized finance, and in today's video, I'm going to explain exactly what they are in under 10 minutes. Let's get into the video. First, what exactly is Curve and why is it so important that people are fighting a war over it? Basically, Curve is the largest decentralized exchange by total value locked, and it's used primarily for swapping like assets. That is, for example, if you're swapping one stablecoin with another, or you're swapping one wrapped version of an asset with another wrapped version of an asset. So for example, swapping USDC with DAI, you might use Curve, or USDC with USDT, you might use Curve. Similarly, if you were swapping REN BTC with wrapped BTC with SBTC, you would likely use Curve. And basically, the curve wars are a competition to get the most liquidity on a specific protocol's stablecoin or pegged asset on Curve. And the reason they care about that is that the stability of a stablecoin is entirely dependent on how much liquidity there is to sell that stablecoin. As you might recall, when Terra USD, UST, collapsed, it was precipitated by someone selling a lot of UST on Curve when there wasn't enough liquidity to support that sale. And so basically the curve wars are trying to avoid that situation by having a lot of liquidity, and more liquidity leads to more adoption for their stablecoin. And so how do they do that? Well, the way they do that is that the different pools have different curve allocations. So in addition to earning trading fees for providing liquidity on that pool, you receive some of Curve's token CRV, and different pools have different rates. And so basically, we'll get to how in a second, but what you need to know now is they are competing to have a higher emissions for Curve on their pool. So for example, Frax is a stablecoin, they would want the rate on their pool to be higher than the rate on DAI, because that's going to incentivize people to move liquidity from the DAI pool over to the Frax pool. And other projects like Abracadabra, previously like Terra, would also compete to have more incentives on their pool. And then before we go into that, the next thing to know is, and this is a complicated topic, but basically this range here, you can see how it ranges from 3.23% to 8.09% for the TriCrypto 2 pool. That means that this 3.23% is the base rate on the pool if you're just providing liquidity, and this 8.09% is the boosted rate, the maximum of the boosted rate, because you can take those curve emissions, you can lock them as veCRV for up to 4 years, and in exchange for locking it, you boost your emissions. So let's look at a quick diagram that I made. You can see that you can lock your curve as veCRV and you boost the APR, and then the Curve fees, so those are just the trading fees, are split between Curve liquidity providers and veCRV stakers. So that's the incentive for actually locking your Curve, is that you can boost your APR and you also receive Curve fees. And so that's great, but we still don't know how are those Curve emissions determined. Well, it turns out that in addition to boosting APR and receiving fees, veCRV holders also vote on how those curve emissions are determined. So you can see here in the diagram, the curve emissions go to Curve liquidity providers, but the veCRV holders vote on them. And then if the liquidity providers so choose, they can take those curve emissions and relock them as veCRV. So we have this nice little cycle here with the Curve fees providing new money coming into the system, and then Curve liquidity providers receiving CRV emissions and then locking those emissions as veCRV to boost their APR, receive more fees, and also vote on how emissions are distributed in the future. And so where do these protocols come in? Well, basically, if you haven't figured it out yet, these protocols want to acquire as much veCRV as possible. And that can either be them purchasing it directly, purchasing it through a third party. We'll go through the largest of those third parties later in the video, Convex, or by paying veCRV holders to vote to incentivize their pools. So that's where something called bribes come in. You've probably heard this term if you've been following Curve. Basically, protocols that want liquidity will offer bribes periodically to veCRV holders in exchange for voting to incentivize their pool. So for example, Frax might pay out Frax, or they might pay out their governance token FXS to veCRV holders in exchange for voting to incentivize the Frax pool. And other protocols are doing the exact same thing. Just calling out Frax because it's well known. And that's another source of new money entering this system. And so that's how this cycle works in a nutshell. But because this veCRV is so important, and because of some other flaws in the system that I'll talk about in a second, a number of other protocols have appeared within the ecosystem of Curve to try to acquire veCRV themselves. Convex is the most important of these protocols that's acquiring a lot of veCRV, and Convex solves a few key problems that arise with the current Curve model. Right now, you can stake your Curve for veCRV to boost the APR of your Curve liquidity pools. However, in order to get the maximum boost, you often need a lot of veCRV. The second problem it solves is that many Curve holders are wary of staking their veCRV for 4 years because it's totally illiquid and the crypto markets are so volatile. So basically what Convex does is it allows Curve holders to trade their Curve for a liquid version of it. And then they take that Curve and they communally stake it for 4 years as veCRV to get the maximum boost, and then allow Curve liquidity providers to bring their LPs to Convex and receive a much larger boost than they would usually be able to get on their own. Let's look at a brief diagram of that. So you can see here, Curve enters the system, it's exchanged for CVX Curve, and then it's taken and it's staked for veCRV by Convex. And then those boosted Curve emissions, 90% of them go back to Curve LPs, and a small amount of them go back to CVX Curve holders, just as an additional incentive for people to stake their Curve there instead of holding it themselves. And then you can see additionally that those normal Curve fees continue to get distributed both to liquidity providers and to the CVX Curve holders. And if you're having trouble understanding this, I'd recommend you pause the video here and look at this diagram to make some sense of it. But that's not where the system ends, because there's additional incentives for people to hold this CVX Curve so that Convex can acquire even more Curve. First, the bribes that we mentioned earlier from protocols that want liquidity are sent to the Convex-owned veCRV holders and then passed on to CVX Curve holders. Additionally, Convex has their own token known as CVX, which also gets sent to CVX Curve holders. And if you're saying, wow, this seems like such a good deal, you do earn a higher APR than you would just by holding Curve itself. And plus it's liquid, which is why so many people have chosen to stake their Curve with Convex. And in fact, by now, Convex controls a majority of all the veCRV because of this. And so how does this CVX have value? Because CVX is only worthwhile as an incentive if it also has some value. And that's because this CVX can then be staked in turn, and you get VLCVX. There's all these different acronyms here. You get VLCVX, and then that VLCVX can do two things. It votes on veCRV governance, so it controls this Convex-owned veCRV, and it also receives Convex fees. So there's some fees built in over here that then go to the VLCVX holders. And that's sort of how the cycle completes. And so how does this all play into the Curve wars? Well, like I mentioned before, these protocols want to control veCRV, and then they also now want to control VLCVX because that controls veCRV by proxy. As you recall, Convex now has most of the veCRV, and that veCRV is controlled by the Convex governance locked token, VLCVX. And so basically what the Curve wars are these different protocols competing to control veCRV and competing to control VLCVX. And depending on the prices of these various assets, it may be more economical to control one versus the other, or to just simply bribe current veCRV holders to vote the way that they want them to. And that's what the Curve wars are in a nutshell. Hope you guys found this video informative. If you did, please be sure to like and subscribe. And until next time, this is Dynamo DeFi.